Over the last 5 years, the U.S. Congress has released one or multiple pieces of UFO-related legislation, and 2024 is no different, as we've now seen 6 amendments related to the UFO and UAP subject currently being proposed within Congress, with a few more expected to come in the coming months. Let's do a quick overview of those 6 amendments that are currently being proposed by the U.S. Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. And first, we will start with the Safe Airspace for Americans bill, which was originally proposed by Representatives Garcia from California and Grothman from Wisconsin in order to enable a reporting mechanism for civilian pilots to report their encounters. The Safe Airspace for Americans Act would direct the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, to develop and implement clear procedures for the uniform reporting and investigation of UAP sightings by both civilian, key point, and military aviation personnel. The Act would establish a centralized database for the collection and analysis of UAP incident reports, enabling the FAA and other relevant agencies to identify pattern, assess risks, and develop appropriate mitigation strategies. The addition of civilian pilot reporting is important here because all of the previous UFO legislation that we've had so far has only been related to military and other government personnel. Currently, there's no way in which a commercial pilot can report a UAP sighting if they have one. This has been a big effort by former Navy pilot Ryan Graves, who currently runs Americans for Safe Aerospace. And while this was originally introduced in January by Representatives Grothman and Garcia, it has recently been added as an amendment, a proposed amendment for the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2025. The NDAA is the bill that deals with funding and guidance for the military and armed services. It's an omnibus bill that usually has several amendments, and usually the idea behind proposing amendments to an omnibus bill like the NDAA is it increases the likelihood of it passing. If we look historically, the majority of all UAP-related legislation has been passed within the NDAA, so the move from the SAFA bill being a standalone to being amendment is very interesting. Now, this is one of several amendments to the NDAA related to UAP that have been proposed. This is the first one. Let's move on to number 2. On May 17th, we saw the introduction of the UAP Transparency Act, which was originally introduced by Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee, alongside 3 co-sponsors, Representative Jared Moskowitz of Florida, Representative Anna Paulina Luna, also of Florida, and Representative Eric Burleson of Missouri. As many of you may know, they make up part of the membership of the existing Congressional UAP caucus, who are focused on pushing forward legislation related to the subject. The bill is very unlikely to get added as an amendment to the NDAA. It's only 1 page, and the goal for the bill would be to force the president and other federal agencies to declassify within 270 days any records they have related to UAP, and then for reporting to begin on the progress on that process after a year and then quarterly afterwards. Without getting too much into the weeds, there are several reasons why this bill both wouldn't be effective and would not pass, but that's for another deep dive video. But that's the number 2 amendment we've seen. So SAFA, Safe Airspace for Americans, followed by the UAP Transparency Act, both being introduced in the House. Let's move on to number 3. Now, the next amendment being proposed again by Representative Garcia, who was one of the co-sponsors for the Safe Airspace for Americans bill, is a little bit inside baseball related to the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO. If you've watched this channel before, you're familiar with AARO. If you're new, it is the current UFO office based in the Pentagon, whose goal is twofold: provide public transparency on what the Pentagon does know about the subject, as well as integrate current and existing data related to the topic so that they can identify whether these things are drone or weather phenomenon or things that are truly anomalous. Now, this amendment for Garcia related to AARO is providing additional or increased access specifically to special access, controlled access programs, and programs that are defined under Title 50 instead of Title 10. Title 10 being DoD-related programs, Department of Defense, Title 50 being intelligence community programs like the CIA. Now, if you know the history of the UFO subject, the allegation is that the lead in terms of control of access on information related to this lies within the intelligence community, and then they also work alongside DoD. But historically, the argument has been that AARO has not been able to access these deeper compartmented programs. So this amendment looks to increase the ability for AARO to access these programs. Now, what's interesting is this year we did see AARO's first historical records review report, which was meant to be a look back all the way back to the 1940s on the US government's involvement in the subject. In that report, we see that they made the conclusion that there is no evidence that the US government is in possession of any technology of extraterrestrial origin. But both members in the Senate and the House did not take the report's conclusions at face value.
Why you always lying?
Given this point about their inability to access some of these more deep, classified, and compartmented programs. So the goal with this would be to help increase that access such that they can get better visibility into these alleged UFO crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs. So a little bit inside baseball, but this one, again, AARO is going to continue to be an important entity in this process. So they're continuing to try to beef up its ability to access information. Now that's just number 3. Now, one of the most interesting amendments we've seen proposed so far this year is actually a remix of an amendment we saw at the end of last year that was a major deal, the UAP Disclosure Act. Now, if you didn't follow the progress last year, the Senate introduced a version of this bill that was 63 pages that created a 9-person presidentially appointed review board that had to be Senate confirmed, that would have subpoena power and the ability to provide whistleblowers effectively an amnesty program with allegations that both the executive branch of the federal government as well as private corporate contractors are in possession not only of technology of non-human origin, but also biological material of non-human origin. And it defined a controlled disclosure plan by which the US government would bring to the public the reality of that information. The bill is extremely specific, and we have several deep dives on this channel from last year's version. This version proposed by Robert Garcia is only slightly different in a couple of areas. It removed some of the initial introduction section, it kept the review board, it kept the eminent domain clause, and the eminent domain clause caused a lot of controversy because it basically grants the government the right to take any materials from corporations or private citizens that are in the public benefit that are either technologies of non-human origin or biological materials of non-human origin. And there was a lot of consternation amongst several different cohorts about that eminent domain clause. The reintroduction of this bill in the House is interesting because we saw it come out of the Senate last year, and we are expecting a new version of the UAPDA to also come out of the Senate. So the hope here is we see this get further along and over the finish line in the process. But this is a major deal because it clearly outlines throughout the structure of the bill the reason why they know this to be true. It's not conjecture. Why it's been able to be avoided from public disclosure in the past. It clearly defines UAP as not being drones or weather, but specifically these objects that have these capabilities that are beyond known human manufacture. It references the phrase non-human intelligence 23 times in the bill, as well as biological material related to non-human intelligence. This is very specific. And the fact that it's been reintroduced again means that Congress is not convinced by the Pentagon's office explanation for what the historical engagement with this subject has been. So this is going to be a real big one to watch as we go into the NDAA negotiations. But we have 2 more smaller pieces of legislation that are in the Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2025. And as we mentioned, the NDAA is focused on the military and the armed services. The IAA is focused on the intelligence community in the same purpose. Now, in some years, these end up getting combined into a single bill. In some years, they are kept as separate bills. But let's take a look at the 2 amendments that are relevant in the IAA for this year. Now, again, these 2 amendments in the IAA are a little bit inside baseball, but what it does is it reflects the fact that Congress does not believe that they are getting honest answers out of the DoD about what they are doing related to the UAP subject.
I don't believe you.
Now, in the IAA, there are actually 3 UAP amendments, one of which is a very small technical language change that is not super relevant for this conversation. But in Section 1001, there is a new addition to require the Government Accountability Office to do an audit and review of the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, the Pentagon's UFO office. Now, again, they just released the first part of their historical report earlier this year, to which many in Congress did not believe it. Now, having the Government Accountability Office go in and conduct a review of the duties and requirements as it relates to previously enacted law that created AARO, the idea that this is being proposed as an amendment is interesting because having a Government Accountability Office review for a federal agency is not unusual. What is unusual or less common is to see it explicitly stated in legislation, which reflects the higher priority that members of Congress are giving to that review. And again, AARO has been alleged to be a honey trap, or basically a way in which the DoD would get whistleblowers to come forward such that they could shut them down and not let them talk publicly about it. Now, it's important to also reference that the DoD has a very strict policy of non-disclosure that we know as it relates to the UAP subject because of a Freedom of Information Act request from exchanges in 2020 when this first started to become really a part of the mainstream, where they explicitly identified that they would not publicly state anything or provide any photo or imagery related to any subjects of UAP, and that they would need to have all FOIA officers coordinate with a Pentagon spokesperson in terms of making sure that the responses were in line with what the Pentagon wanted to say in order to manage perception. Now, for obvious reasons, AARO has come under a lot of scrutiny, so it's not surprising to see this Government Accountability Office review for their work. Now, the Second Amendment in the IAA, again, a little bit inside baseball, but important. It is an extension of the prevention of the use of funds by the DoD for any programs related to UAP. So last year, we had this pass in the FY24 NDAA where all UAP programs would stop receiving funding if they were unreported to Congress. Again, from whistleblowers like David Grush who've come forward, this has been their allegation, is that there is money that Congress is allocating to the DoD that is being misappropriated and used towards these UFO crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs illegally without reporting it to Congress. So last year, they created the ban of funding going to unreported UAP programs, and that is now being extended for an additional year because last year's version only had that ban going for 1 year. So this is just a slight extension of that. Again, this is a death by 1,000 cuts approach by Congress, where they're going after the gatekeepers at AARO and in DoD. They're trying to provide a pathway for the actual discovery and the overlapping of the classification issue, overriding all of that with the UAPDA. And again, also providing ways for civilian and commercial pilots to be able to report. We know that there's military sightings that are being reported. We've seen an increase in news media coverage of commercial and civilian pilots reporting, but there's still that fear that they're going to get fired or have repercussions for coming forward. So what this all illustrates is there is a very comprehensive, detail-oriented approach by the U.S. Congress to continue to address the UAP subject, and they have been doing so for the last 5 years, and the volume of legislation is increasing in its specificity and its volume. So this is a space that we will be watching closely. Again, these are only proposed pieces of legislation, so the next couple of months are going to be huge advocacy pushes to make sure that both the House and Senate pass all of these amendments so that we can move forward in understanding what is really the truth behind the UFO phenomenon, at least as it pertains to the government's understanding of the issue. And just a last quick note, if you want to know more about the Safe Airspace for Americans bill or the UAPDA, we have 2 really great white papers at uapcaucus.com at the links linked here. So go check that out if you're interested in getting a little bit more of a deeper dive into what the bills mean and what the implications are.